Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast, Sunday, November the 27th. Every Sunday, of course, we have the chance to take a week in review, a week ahead outlook. But on this occasion, I want to be a little bit more indulgent as we move towards the end of the year. And reflect more broadly on a sort of at least month in review, if not year, with some sense of looking ahead, at least through to the end of the year, as far as one can see, which might even in these times be beyond any horizon. But we come to the end of November with oil prices on Brent crude having dropped $15 a barrel from early November, where they were sitting at $98 plus, with the wind of OPEC plus decision to cut supply, and now we end the month in 83 plus territory. And so it is something to ponder, the trend line. Let's kick off this morning with James McCallum, chairman of Exergy and Strathclyde University professor of energy. James, your thoughts as we come to the end of November with that trend line on Brent, despite all the best efforts by OPEC Plus to keep prices propped up above 90, they seem to be losing the battle. Your thoughts?
Morning, Sean. Morning, Boran. Everybody listening in. The sentiment around oil in the markets is clearly in sort of bearish territory now. The sort of concerns for supply not really impacting the markets, and you see that in terms of the, if you like, the cut in production announcement now, obviously priced into the price of a barrel of oil, and yet that price is continuing to fall. Prices now in contango, so prices for later dates higher than prompt prices. So clearly the sentiment is that prices will continue to soften. I noted before the podcast started there, you put up the question and answer from last week, I think Thursday, where sentiment around Chinese COVID restrictions clearly having a big impact on demand from the listeners. I think that's probably true. I was surprised in that survey question how high the percentage, I think it was 18%, actually thought that the if you like, the cap on Russian oil prices would have an impact. I think will have very little impact, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think the markets are already sort of like taking a concerted view of that price cap, of the, if you like, the increase in production, and looking ahead and saying demand in China down, continued negative sentiment around the economy, although I suspect we'll come back to that later on in terms of what's actually happening in the broader markets. And the sentiment is that a barrel of oil is pretty fully priced where it is right now, and probably will continue to soften over the course of the coming weeks.
Bora Barryman, managing partner, Hormuz Straits Partnership. Bora, we're more or less back to where we were pre-Russia's invasion of Ukraine. $83, $85, 80 whatever dollars a barrel. Good price. If you offered it to the neighborhood here in the Middle East as an average for next year on Brent, they'd probably bite your hand off it. It seems that despite all the drama of Ukraine, we're just back to where we started.
Correct. But where we started has been pushed around by a lot of different currents. And we might be lucky to be where we started, depending on your point of view, right? We are looking at the prospect of a long period of slow growth to negative growth, which is very much openly engineered by the US Fed. And the aim of that is to recover the credibility of the Fed in light of the damage caused by the inflation is transitory narrative. So we're looking at, I would say, quite a broad-based period of economic pain at, especially in the G7 world, with a 5.5% Fed rate, and you see the jobs shedding in major countries like the U.S. and Germany is already in a recession right now. So that being said, for the energy producers in the Middle East, this might be the best of times, right? Because you have Russia being sort of painted into a corner to a certain extent, Asia at bay, but Russian supplies, I would say, strategically pivoting in that direction. And what stands out to me is the underinvestment into the industry. I think it's a sufficient price for the NOCs of the Middle East and then maybe the global majors with their massive reserve bases, but I don't see sort of marginal fields, places like Africa, attracting the investment that they require to really solve the underinvestment problem that is creating a lot of these bottlenecks in the world.
James, if you take that perspective that the 80 plus that we started the year with pre-Ukraine was sitting on a sort of an upward moving tide of still somewhat accommodating central bank policy, still printing money, still very low interest rates. Now we end the year with the 80 plus sitting on the opposite, the punch bowls being taken away and the economic outlook is fractured and hence the downward draft. Is there anything there, as you look in the current profile, that this draft downward stops? That we reached with $15 on the barrel in the month of November? Is that it, or is this keep dropping? What's your thoughts on what could support it from what's like, because it was well supported at the start of the year. Now this $80 feels like it's downward.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? I think your point is absolutely correct, Sean, that, turn the clock back a year and $83 would have seemed, oh yeah, that's all pretty supportive and indeed supportive, if you like, of the balance sheets of the major Middle East producers. It's interesting to reflect on a year where almost certainly the widespread sentiment was that OPEC plus, and indeed for that, here Saudi and to a slightly lesser extent the United Arab Emirates would defend a price point of 90. Now, clearly, the last week and a bit has shown that defending 90 is not as easy as perhaps it might have seemed 4 or 5 months ago. The markets are back, as you say, where they started the year, yet despite the fact that we've actually had a great deal of sort of issues to deal with through the course of the year, not least of which of course the Russian-Ukraine conflict. I think underpinning that is a fact that the markets are blowing past an awful lot of the issues that might have seemed big ticket issues in the past. For instance, the sort of G7 cap on Russian oil prices at 60 to 70 or 65 to 75, assuming that they can reach agreement. I'm not sure they will, but assuming that they do. But Russian oil already finding its way into the markets at somewhere around $55 a barrel. So totally irrelevant, really, as a point. Gas constraints into Europe, which immediately post the conflict, of course, creating enormous amounts of turmoil in the market. And yet here we are at the end of the year, gas stocks in Europe, are higher than where everybody expected them to be. Russian gas finding its way, through Iran to Turkey to Europe. Even if you come away for a second from the big national oil producers into the conversation that's beginning to bubble up out of the United States of the big US independent producers, actually now beginning to look at Venezuela as a source of of getting back to the knitting and looking to produce, sort of like the larger undeveloped fields in Venezuela as a pathway back to business as normal. So an awful lot of pushing past these big issues and presenting to the world a market where, in actual fact, oil will find its way, from the suppliers to the demand side, and there is relatively little, other than perhaps a couple of little articles which you've got, which is that there is a growing worry around sort of drone attacks on infrastructure, which could have spikes in terms of price. But for me, I think as we come to the end of the year at an $80 price point, I think we're back defending the price point that we started the year with, and that's probably about right.
Probably with a weaker hand. Bora, it seemed that through the month of November that there was a divergence with the energy markets and the other financial markets, the equity markets, which took a major uplift on the outlook that the Fed had reached sort of peak velocity, if you like, in terms of future increases of rates. And so consequently, the optimism came back into the equity markets, but yet not into the economic outlook that would support the energy markets. How are those two aligned? How can those two exist in the same moment?
I think the energy markets are living in the real world, and the equity markets are forward-looking, as they say. I think this was a bit of a rally predicated on some view that the Fed will not raise further beyond sort of this next expected round of 75 basis points, bringing us to around the 5.5% Fed rate. But I'm not sure how a lot of the economy in the real world is going to cope with that. And perhaps that's what the energy price is reflecting. There's going to be a lot of job efficiencies, as we saw it in Silicon Valley, being implemented because they're not getting free money anymore. So there's going to be that negative trickle down of cost rationalizations, jobs being sort of cut out of whole sectors of the economy. And that will have its impact on the demand for energy in the G7 nations, won't it?
I mean, we did have, Bora, Black Friday, as it's called, the day after Thanksgiving, just Friday past. Online sales hit record. So the U.S. consumer, which is always the kind of bionic pillar that keeps the U.S. economy thumping along, seems to be in a pretty healthy place right now.
Look, I don't necessarily get that. Maybe they haven't got the memo. Because there's clearly a couple years of basically 1% to negative growth on the cards for the US, right? For the US consumer. And I think it's even worse for the European consumer.
Maybe the sort of trickle down impact of 475 basis points hasn't quite kicked people where it hurts in terms of the mortgage payments yet, or not. But nonetheless, James, I wanted to get your view on the reports of where we are in terms of rig count, and a story that we were carrying in our digest today, that global drilling stages a belated comeback is the headline, which I immediately thought of you, of course. It has been a long time coming, but upstream activity globally does look like it's responding to the price rebound. Your thoughts generally, rig count now up almost 40% over the same period in 2021. Where is that? What does that tell us? What do you think that means?
Yeah, and it's always amusing when one gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning, Sean, to see which particular news feed the team have put on there for me to have a quick read at. So thank you to them for that. Clearly a very exaggerated title there, but I guess that's what journalists are paid to do. Yes, there is that sort of short-term rise in activity that looks quite dramatic when you use numbers like 40% or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, I remain in the same place that I have been all year. These numbers are very, very small in terms of where the market, of where the rig count was and where the service companies' activity was, as recently as 2014. The rigs, if you take the markets individually, the United States shale oil market still continuing to not invest, pay back to their shareholders high dividends. Where they do invest in activity, it's in recompletions and incremental production of wells, which are predominantly drilled. And as I've said before, that's borne out by taking a look at the OSX index, which is the index of not just the drillers, but also the service companies, the companies who actually provide all of the equipment to do the new drilling, the Schlumbergers, the Halliburtons, the Baker Hughes. Now, whilst that index is also up, nearly 50% on the year, and you would think that looks really, really good. It's sitting at around about 90 points against a 2014 position of 300 points. So you can see hugely down on where it was as recently as 2014. So activity is not flooding back into the shale oil, shale gas basins in the United States. International rig activity, perhaps with the exception of Asia, which was relatively steady throughout the post-COVID period. International rig count, big mobile drilling rigs, just not happening. And back to something which Bora said earlier on, although Bora, you use the word, marginal around the fields of West Africa, which I'll just pick up on, because obviously the whole West African play is never about marginal fields. It's about big fields. It's about deep water drilling. Just virtually decimated in terms of its activity there. Perhaps a little bright light in Angola, but still versus where it was, where we in the late, the turn of the millennium, where we would have seen that whole deep water activity in the Gulf of Mexico, off of South America, off of West Africa, just absolutely decimated, Sean.
Bora, it does point to that perhaps that is where the rebound in this oil price could come from, that the capacity increasing, the new capacity is just not coming in any great numbers. And if we were to see a China reopen, and I just wanted to dive into China a little bit as a big story this year, China's last month has been one of multiple sort of false dawns coming out of the Communist Party. There was an optimistic sense that things were being lifted and the support for the real estate, and then the market backed away from the reality, and now it's on a COVID crunch again. But where China goes, this oil market could go. Your thoughts on where is China, Bora?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't see China coming out of their COVID emergency, the permanent emergency that's been, that we lived for a small period of time, but they've been living with since COVID began. And that's a political decision. That's the outcome of their system that's dominated by one personality. The sooner this emergency ends, the sooner they will normalize, because they'll experience the same dynamics of the virus as the rest of the world experienced. But the longer they have this lockdown mentality, I think they'll keep their China's outlook will be under a cloud of uncertainty. People don't know if they can set foot outside their home or their neighborhood. So it's this disproportionate policy is resulting in some very unusual sights that we haven't seen in China for many decades. These mass demonstrations and disorders, and I don't see that ending as long as this policy remains in place, and it seems to be firmly in place.
James, your thoughts, of course, over the last decade in your work, you've spent a lot of time going to China, seeking out the partnerships in terms of the your work in subsurface and engineering. I point out those points because I wanted to get your thoughts on what is the legacy impact of this moment in China, even if this thing finds a resolution, and one can only imagine that in 2023 it has to shift here. But what is the legacy? We had the German leader over the weekend saying how surprised he was of how dependent German companies are on China. I'm just wondering your thoughts on the legacy impact here, regardless of when China, will we see a supply chain shift?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sean. And I think absolutely there is going to be a shift. There's whether it's the United States or indeed, as you've said, the German Chancellor commenting about the level of dependency which has developed quietly in the background of the major US market, the major European markets into China. There is definitely going to be a pullback in terms of that. Now, it's not going to stop, to be honest with you, because obviously China remains the manufacturing center for a great deal of technology, and it's there are some things which have just dropped off of our conversation over the course of the last year, which I think will reemerge in 2023. And the technology battle between the United States and China is one of them. That's gone off of our rhetoric. That will come back. But we're seeing, if you like, already the sort of the impact of COVID, China's policy, and the dependency issues coming to a head with, if you like, the major disruptions that are going on with Apple's major factory in the United States. And it's really interesting to observe that, because coming back to a point which you made earlier on about the international markets, particularly US, and to be honest with you, the FTSE in the UK, seemingly just riding across the top of the current economic environment on what would seem to be relatively thin evidence that interest rate hikes are going to begin to slow down. I thought Andy Levin made a very good point on Thursday, by the way, about that a very big part of that must be about the amount of liquidity that was forced into the market during the COVID cycle, and people, I suppose, feeling like the times are where they're comfortable enough pushing into Christmas, pushing into the end of the year, markets being where they are, to get a bit of the money out from under the bed and put it into those markets to bring stability. But I think the reality is that there is going to be a price to pay in that regard. For instance, if you simply think that people are bringing out money to spend, putting it into new technology, buying that new iPad for Christmas, that new iPhone or whatever, and yet the factory in China shutting down, unable to manufacture the components that actually go into that product, financial results will be impacted by that. And companies like Apple will need to shift from single source supply to at least having a plan B in the event of China's position doesn't tend to soften or become more internationally open over the course of 23, 24. And I think that's a very, very good thing for the world, because I think what we have seen, whether it's Europe's dependency on Russia for gas, or the United States and Europe's dependency on China for technology componentry or rare metals, as the world begins to globalize in terms of its supply chain, that can only be a really good thing for stability in the long term.
Does it impact the energy, the oil industry supply chain? Obviously, a lot of rigs made in China, a lot of other, kit, if you like. And of course, the Chinese energy companies are competing aggressively across the world. Does this intersect in any way? Is there a nexus here to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think you can't take that question without reflecting on who is going to be producing the oil over the course of the next decade and 2 decades. And that brings us back to the point you made earlier on, which is that the stalwart of all of this is the national oil companies. I think Bora focused in on this. If there's anything in the energy markets that has shifted enormously in the course of the last 2 years, it is the dynamic of the major oil and gas independents, the Shells, the BPs, the Totals, the Exxons, the Chevrons, of this world versus the role that the national oil companies actually take. And we've seen that in terms of the swing in the last year from the United States being the swing oil producer to OPEC pulling back firmly, riding that storm, and now very much in control of what actually happens to oil prices, give or take the if you like, the idiosyncrasies of the last couple of weeks around Saudi's position. But the national oil companies increasingly taking their supply of componentry and equipment from China, and at the same time developing a stronger relationship with China in terms of supplying the core product of oil, and in return, China coming into the Middle East as an investor. And that dynamic has changed enormously in the course of the last 5 years.
I want to just finish up with that segue, James, into the OPEC Plus discussion, and firstly get the survey question on, which is about obviously looking forward to December. Brent crude oil dropped $15 a barrel in November from the 98 plus at the beginning of the month to 83 plus at the end of the month. What will happen in December? Prices keep falling to below 80. Prices rebound back to 90s. Prices hover in the 80s. Bora, I suppose a lot of answering of that question are the two dates that are coming up next week in November or December 4th. OPEC Plus meets in Vienna. December 5th is the beginning of the EU oil embargo. Your thoughts on the decision that OPEC Plus is facing? Do you expect them to adjust again after the 2 million cut only in early October when they met, but only came into effect in early November? What is your outlook for December and OPEC Plus decision making?
Look, we heard very very clearly that the OPEC Plus decision previously was very carefully calibrated. It was a technical decision. So on the basis of those technical factors, I would expect OPEC to take sort of a similar strategy, perhaps even reducing production quotas. But there came a big backlash, political backlash, wasn't there? And that's the question. Do they want to deal with that heat? But again, the underlying dynamic is the US Fed, the governor of the Bank of England, all modeling, 2-year sort of slow growth outlooks for the West. And then we have China, who knows where they're going to go. So the demand dynamics are weak, but nevertheless, the world needs this oil. So that Africa and non-China Asia definitely growing. They have a long way to go in developing their economy. So I see this tension between sort of underinvestment into the oil complex and perhaps short-term softening of the oil price, but the medium-term outlook for price spikes upward as you get more of this basically supply chain tension bubbling over.
James, your sort of final word on your outlook for December and where OPEC Plus decision making goes. Inevitably, as we've been talking about new capacity or the struggle with capacity, clearly many OPEC Plus producers struggle with regaining their production after the COVID collapse. Your thoughts on the decision OPEC Plus faces?
Yeah, I find it very hard to think that they will revise their decision before the current production announcement has really begun to flow through to the markets, although some people would say it has, and it's not having an effect which is satisfactory. I come back to your point that $80 a barrel at the beginning of the year, ending the year, would have seemed like a price point which was the one that the Middle East economies would have defended. And so $80 a barrel doesn't seem that bad in the current environment. I think they will stick where they are just now. I don't think they'll make any radical change. Worth reminding ourselves that Bora's point is absolutely right, that in terms of the international community, there is relatively little reinvestment into addressing new production in large international fields. But two countries in particular have continued to invest in the ability to increase production. That's Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And they will take an increasingly stronger and stronger position in the OPEC plus community in controlling where the price needs to be. And there's two of the countries in the Middle East who have a very, very tight relationship with their fiscal balance of payments and if you like, the production revenues that come from their hydrocarbon fields. They will control that very, very tightly. Countries like Angola, Nigeria, many of the other OPEC producers unable to respond to a need to increase production, even if they wanted to. So I think in 2023, we'll see a stronger Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates voice in OPEC. We'll see a diversification of the major international oil companies into previously discovered large oil fields where the margin of production is much greater than in the shale oil, shale gas basins of the United States. And I think we'll see flat other international activity and Asian onshore activity continuing to probably stick where it is.
Yes, well, we'll have to wrap it up there. I suppose a lot will depend on this trend line that we've been talking about, $15 over the course of November. If that trend line continues over the next week, literally, and OPEC Plus are meeting on December 4th with Brent in the 70s, I think there could be a lot of heat within the group to take further action. And of course, they took 2 million cut in early October, implemented in early November, and yet there was still another million in terms of the gap between production quotas and production actual output. Perhaps that third million might be on the chopping block for removal if indeed Brent is in the 70s when they meet. And so I think the next week will be quite a critical indicator as to where that final decision goes. But nonetheless, absolutely wonderful chatting with you guys, Bora Bariman and James McCallum. Really great to have your insights this Sunday with the sort of bigger picture review and outlook. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much. All the best.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks,
James.